Hello, I'm Ewoud. I work for the Dutch organization Aim for Human Rights. I'm going to give you a brief presentation on the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. I'll first explain what an enforced disappearance is, and then we'll go into the convention, how it was negotiated, the new committee, and at the end we'll explain a bit how the campaign for the ratification of this convention is going. I hope you enjoy this presentation. So what is an enforced disappearance? It is a very complex crime and violation. But in the first place, it's a situation in which there's no information about a relative, someone from your family, which causes untold suffering to, well, not only the person made to disappear, but also his or her relatives. So in a definition, usually there's three elements. One is the person is deprived of liberty, is detained, is arrested. Often that occurs in vague circumstances at the early hours in the morning, during manifestations, for instance, or at roadblocks. The second element is that the arrestation, the detention is denied, or there's no information given about that detention. So somehow it's taking someone and then say, we haven't taken him. And the third element is that it's committed by persons or actors pertaining to the state. So the state is actually actively involved in making people disappear, and that makes it a human rights violation. The state's supposed to protect human rights, and instead of that, during an enforced disappearance, your rights are violated. But it's also a crime that should be dealt with under criminal law. The individual responsible should be tried and brought before justice. And the third dimension is the humanitarian, the untold suffering it brings to relatives. Enforced disappearances occur in more than 80 countries around the world. So it often has this image of being a Latin American phenomenon from the past. It's not. It's happening. And there's not such a thing as an old case, because an enforced disappearance perdures. It continues in time. It only ends when the truth is revealed about the fate or the whereabouts of the person. Yeah, with the big waves of disappearances in Latin America in the 70s, 80s, Chile, Argentina, relatives quite quickly discovered this is a new phenomenon and international law is insufficient. There was insufficient possibilities to respond to the phenomenon. So the call for international law and new treaties was launched very early in the 80s. The United Nations started with a humanitarian working group on against enforced disappearances in 1981. And the call for a convention started with a meeting in Paris called the Refusal of Oblivion, so le refus de l'oubli, in which for the first time relatives from Latin America asked for a convention. The work within the United Nations went first through the adoption of a declaration in 1992 and continued towards a convention that would be legally binding. They didn't wait that long in Latin America, and the Inter-American system adopted a regional Inter-American Convention against enforced disappearance in 1994. The work within the UN stagnated somehow, also when the international community started working on the Rome Statute and creating the International Criminal Court. But finally, between 2002 and 2006, the negotiations of this new treaty happened and led to the adoption of this universal and binding instrument, binding treaty, the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. So the negotiations started in January 2003. They went surprisingly fast. I mean, it took 30 years to get to this convention, but the negotiations themselves went very fast. Within 3 years, get a text adopted within the United Nations is quite remarkable. Maybe a first thing to say, negotiations are between states. So it's the delegations, it's the diplomats of member states of the United Nations who negotiate the text. But in this intercession working group that worked on that text, NGOs were also present with their very good technical knowledge about human rights law. But also the relatives were present, the federations of relatives of disappeared persons from Asia, from Latin America, from other countries were present in the room, and that had a very big impact on these negotiations. Another important thing is the role of the French chairmanship, who worked on the basis of broad agreement first, a few principles, which allowed to later not return back on your steps and move forward very quickly into filling in the details and be consequent. So I think these factors all contributed to obtaining a very strong human rights instrument at the end.